A young woman lowered her phone and looked toward her companion. Did they ever explain what happened? I didn't hear anything. Neither. Did I? The answer unsettled them both. Several passengers had witnessed the same interaction. Nobody could point to a rule being broken. Nobody had heard a threat. Nobody had seen resistance. Only questions. Only suspicion. And then security. The young couple, who had remained silent, earlier exchanged another glance. This time, the man spoke first. They looked like any other family. His partner stared toward the empty gate. That's exactly why it bothers me. Around them, similar conversations quietly emerged. Not loud enough to create confrontation, just enough to spread doubt. The atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to concern. Jessica remained near the boarding desk, organizing papers with deliberate focus. She could feel the occasional glance coming her way. Passengers were no longer looking at the family. They were looking at her, not accusing, not challenging, simply wonderings. That difference mattered. Their confidence she normally drew from public approval felt strangely absent. Meanwhile, farther down the terminal, Malcolm walked beside the officers without speaking. Angela stayed close. The children remained unusually quiet. Behind them, dozens of strangers carried pieces of the same unanswered question, and as those questions multiplied from person to person, something important began changing. People were no longer observing an incident. They were beginning to form judgments of their own. The questions followed them down the terminal, not spoken loudly, not officially, but they were there. The officers guided the family toward a quieter area, away from the boarding crowd. One of them glanced back briefly, as if checking whether anyone had followed. Nobody had, yet the weight of hundreds of unseen judgments seemed to trail behind them. The older officer finally slowed his pace. His expression remained professional. Still, there was something uncertain in his eyes now. He looked at Malcolm. "Sir, I'd appreciate your cooperation." Malcolm nodded. "You have it." The officer hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Would you like me to make this difficult?" The question hung in the air. Angela looked up. Immediately, the children exchanged confused glances. Even the younger officer seemed surprised by the wording. Malcolm held the officer's gaze. His answer came without anger, without sarcasm, without fear. No, just one word, nothing more. The simplicity of it changed everything. The officer blinked, as if he had prepared himself for frustration, for arguments, for resistance. Instead, he found calm. A man standing beside his family. A man who appeared more interested in preserving his children's peace than defending his pride. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly are we investigating?" he asked quietly. No one answered right away. That silence felt different from the others. Not defensive, not hostile, revealing. Angela noticed it first. The officers no longer looked certain. They looked confused. Malcolm noticed it, too. The situation had quietly changed direction. Moments earlier, authority had moved toward him with confidence. Now uncertainty had begun. Moving in the opposite direction, the older officer glanced down at the boarding documents again. then back at Malcolm. Nothing about the family matched the concern that had brought security here, and for the first time since this began, the tension no longer belonged to the Reed family alone. It had started settling on everyone else instead. The silence lingered after the officers stopped speaking. Nobody seemed certain what came next. The older officer looked down at the boarding passes once more. The documents remained exactly what they had always been: .valid, .correct, .ordinary. Yet, an entire chain of events had unfolded around them. Malcolm noticed his daughter watching him, his son too. Both children were searching his face for answers, for reassurance, for a way to understand something that made no sense. He knew that look. Years from now, they might forget airport gates, flight numbers, and departure times. They would not forget this feeling, the feeling of being treated differently, without understanding why. The older officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we're just trying to resolve the situation." Malcolm nodded. "I understand." His voice remained steady. No anger, no accusation, just quiet certainty. The officer seemed relieved, as though cooperation somehow made the entire situation easier to accept. Malcolm glanced toward his children, then toward the terminal behind him. Passengers still moved through the airport. Announcements still echoed overhead. Life continued, but something important had already happened. He looked back at the officer. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Malcolm broke the silence. "When this is over, I don't need an apology." The officer frowned slightly. Malcolm continued, "I don't need anyone punished either." The younger officer looked surprised. "What do you want then?" Malcolm took a slow breath. His children watched every word. So did the officers. So did a few nearby travelers who had drifted close enough to listen. Finally, he answered, "I'd like you to remember it." The sentence landed softly. No raised voice, no dramatic speech, yet nobody looked away because the request carried something heavier than anger, responsibility. The officers exchanged a brief glance. Neither responded. They didn't have to. The silence that followed said enough, and for the first time, discomfort belonged entirely to those who had the power. Evelyn kept her eyes on the space the family had just left behind. The boarding area looked normal again, but the feeling in the room had changed. People returned to their phones, their coffee, their conversations. Still, nobody seemed present. A man across from her shook his head. Strange situation. What was strange about it? Evelyn asked. He hesitated. "I don't know. Just felt off." "That's because it was." The man looked away. Evelyn had heard that silence before. She had sat through hearings where witnesses avoided simple truths. She had watched people describe discrimination without ever saying the word. The language changed. The pattern never did. Near the gate, Jessica resumed boarding passengers. "Welcome aboard." "Good afternoon." "Right this way." Her voice sounded steady. Too steady. Evelyn studied her for a moment. A woman beside her leaned closer. "You think something happened?" "I think everyone here knows something happened." "Then why isn't anyone saying anything?" Evelyn glanced around the terminal. "Because most people are waiting to see if someone else will." The woman folded her arms. "That family didn't look dangerous." "No." They looked embarrassed. Evelyn nodded. That's usually the point. The woman went quiet at the gate. Boarding continued as if nothing had occurred. Yet several passengers kept looking toward the hallway where Malcolm and his family had disappeared. They were not looking with suspicion anymore. They were looking with doubt. Evelyn opened her bag and removed her phone, but it carried the weight of experience. She checked the recording application and held the device loosely in her hand. Years of public service had taught her one lesson above all others. Memory fades. Institutions rewrite events. People protect themselves. Evidence survives. As another announcement echoed through the terminal, Evelyn pressed record and lifted her eyes toward the gate again. Malcolm and his family disappeared around the corner, but the feeling they left behind remained at the gate. Senator Evelyn Brooks watched the corridor for a moment, then looked back toward the boarding desk. A businessman beside her shook his head. That didn't look right. No, Evelyn said quietly. It didn't. Jessica resumed scanning tickets, as if nothing had happened. A woman across the aisle whispered, "Maybe there was a security issue." Was there? Evelyn asked. The woman hesitated. "I don't know. That's the problem," Evelyn replied. The gate fell silent again. Evelyn unlocked her phone and opened the camera. The businessman glanced at her. "You think this matters?" "I think details matter." A small red light appeared on the screen. Nobody noticed. Jessica smiled at another passenger. "Welcome aboard." The passenger smiled back, but the exchange felt strained now. The businessman leaned closer. "You really believe something happened here?" Evelyn kept recording. "I believe people reveal themselves when they think nobody is watching." Near the desk, 2 employees spoke in hushed voices. "Was that family actually removed?" "I think so." "Why?" The second employee looked away. "I'm not sure." Evelyn captured every word she could. Not because she wanted attention, not because she wanted a fight, because she had seen this pattern before. Years earlier, different faces had used different excuses. The language changed. The outcome rarely did. A young passenger approached her row. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Were you watching that too?" "Yes." "It felt wrong." Evelyn nodded. "Then remember what you saw." The young man glanced toward the gate. "I will." For the first time that morning, doubt began spreading faster than authority. Jessica continued working. The crowd continued boarding. But a record now existed. Now they searched for facts, and facts were harder to find. Jessica continued moving through the cabin, unaware that confidence in her actions was slowly eroding. Passengers still accepted drinks from her, still thanked her politely, still smiled when she approached. But afterward, conversations resumed. Questions returned. Doubts multiplied. Near the window, Evelyn remained silent. She did not need to guide the discussion. The passengers were arriving there themselves, one question at a time, one hesitation at a time, one uncomfortable realization at a time. And that process had only just begun. The seatbelt sign remained on, but almost nobody seemed focused on it. The aircraft had reached cruising altitude, yet the mood inside the cabin felt heavier than before. A flight attendant rolled a cart forward, offering drinks with practiced smiles. Most passengers responded politely, but conversations kept drifting back to the gate. Did anyone actually see what happened? A man asked. I saw enough, the woman beside him replied. Then why didn't we say anything? She looked down at her cup. I don't know. Across the aisle, another passenger exhaled. Because we thought someone else would. Nobody argued. Jessica moved through the cabin, checking seat numbers and answering routine requests. On the surface, everything looked normal, yet she noticed conversations stopping whenever she came near. Can I get you anything else? She asked a businessman. He hesitated. No, thank you. His tone was courteous, but distant. For the first time, Jessica felt something she could not name. Near the window, Evelyn watched quietly. Her phone remained face down, the recording safely saved. She said nothing, but she noticed everything. A young traveler glanced toward the empty seats again. The kids looked excited before all that, he said softly. Yeah, someone answered. That's the part I keep thinking about. Another pause. Then a voice from the back added. If everything was legitimate, why were they removed? No one had an answer. The question lingered between strangers, connecting people who had boarded as individuals and were now sharing the same uneasy memory. Jessica continued working, but each polite response felt slightly colder than the last. The certainty that had carried her through the morning no longer felt solid. Around her, doubt was taking shape, quiet and invisible, moving from seat to seat without permission. Outside, the sky stayed clear, but inside, accountability began. The question refused to leave the cabin, and by the time the aircraft touched down, it had already followed several passengers home. Miles away, Senator Evelyn Brooks sat alone at her kitchen table. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside her window. She opened the recording again and watched from the beginning. No angry outbursts, no resistance, no threat, just a family asking simple questions. While being treated like a problem, Evelyn paused the video and leaned back. I've seen this before, she whispered. Not the people, not the airport, the pattern, the same calm authority, the same assumptions, the same expectation that nobody would look closely enough to challenge the story. Later, she pressed play once more. Malcolm's voice remained steady. Angela stayed focused on protecting the children, even the confusion on the children's faces felt impossible to ignore. Evelyn watched until the final frame ended. Then, she reached for her phone. For a moment, she hesitated. Years in public life had taught her that truth rarely arrived alone. Attention followed it. Arguments followed it. Pressure followed it. Still, silence carried its own cost. She opened a social media account and uploaded the video, exactly as it was. No dramatic music, no edits, no accusations, only a short caption. Watch carefully, nothing more. The upload finished. The post disappeared into the endless stream of online content where millions of stories competed for attention every day. Evelyn set her phone down and walked away. She expected a few comments, maybe a few thousand views, maybe less. What she did not know was that dozens of passengers had already been discussing the incident online. Questions were spreading faster than answers. Doubt was spreading faster than explanations. And somewhere inside airline offices, executives were still enjoying a quiet evening, completely unaware that a single video had just begun moving toward them. By morning, the silence surrounding the Reed family would no longer belong to the airport. It would belong to everyone. By sunrise, the video was no longer sitting quietly on Evelyn Brooks's account. It was moving from screen to screen, shared by strangers who had never met the Reed family, but could not stop watching what happened to them. At first, the responses arrived one at a time. Something feels wrong here. Why were they removed? Did anyone explain anything? Then the numbers started climbing. Hundreds of comments became thousands. Views multiplied faster than anyone expected. People replayed the footage repeatedly, searching for details they might have missed the first time. A college student paused the video on Malcolm's face. "Look at him," she wrote. "He's not arguing. He's trying to understand." Others focused on Angela. "She's protecting the kids." Someone else pointed out the children's expressions. "They look scared." The discussion kept growing. What surprised viewers most was not what happened. It was what did not happen. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no scene. The family never raised their voices. They simply asked questions. That restraint made the footage harder to dismiss. People were accustomed to seeing conflict packaged as entertainment. This felt different. A former flight attendant commented beneath the video, "I've worked in aviation for 15 years. If tickets were invalid, procedures would look very different." Thousands liked the post. Soon, body language experts, travel bloggers, attorneys, and ordinary travelers joined the conversation. Each person noticed something new. The pauses, the hesitation, the repeated ticket checks, the growing discomfort. Around the gate, what once looked routine now appeared increasingly difficult to explain. Hours earlier, the incident had belonged only to those present at the airport. Now millions of strangers were examining every second. The story was no longer controlled by official reports or company statements. It belonged to public observation, and with every replay, the same conclusion surfaced. People were not reacting to anger. They were reacting to dignity, being questioned in plain sight as millions continued replaying the footage. One repost changed the direction of the entire conversation. A well-known investigative account shared Evelyn's video with only 7 words. "Did anyone verify their tickets before this?" Nothing else. No accusations, no opinion, just a question. Within minutes, the post began spreading faster than the original clip. People copied it. Reporters quoted it. Travel bloggers repeated it. The question appeared beneath thousands of comments. Soon, it became impossible to avoid. Did anyone verify their tickets? Was there actually a problem? What justified removing that family? Users searched the footage again, hoping to find an answer. Hidden somewhere in the interaction, there wasn't one. No explanation appeared. No evidence surfaced. No airline representative responded. The silence grew, heavier with every passing hour. A lawyer reviewing the video posted, "If there was a legitimate issue, why hasn't anyone explained it?" 20,000 people agreed before lunchtime. A former airport supervisor added, "Verification should be easy to confirm. This shouldn't take long." Still nothing. Inside the airline, executives exchanged emails and scheduled meetings. Publicly, they remained quiet. Privately, concern was spreading. The longer they waited, the more damaging the unanswered question became. People were no longer debating feelings. They were looking for facts. and facts required documentation. Tay, television producer, preparing an evening segment, paused the footage and stared at Malcolm, standing calmly beside his family. Find out whether those tickets were valid, she told her team. Tonight, across social media, patience was disappearing, not because viewers had reached a conclusion, because nobody seemed willing to provide one. The absence of an answer began sounding like an answer itself. What started as a video was becoming an investigation, and for the first time since the family left the gate, attention shifted away from the Reed family and toward the people responsible for explaining what happened. That shift would change everything next. That shift happened faster than anyone inside the airline expected. The public had spent hours searching for evidence against the Reed family. Instead, they kept finding reasons to admire them. News channels replayed the footage. Social media accounts slowed videos down, frame by frame. Comment sections filled with observations. He's staying calm. Look at the wife protecting those kids. The children aren't causing any trouble. Again and again, people arrived at the same conclusion. The family never behaved like a threat. They never demanded special treatment. They never created a disturbance. A morning television host paused the video during a live segment. Watch their faces, she said. The screen showed Malcolm standing quietly beside his family. Most people would be angry. Her co-host nodded. But he's trying to understand what's happening. Across the country, viewers noticed details they had missed. Before, Angela's hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder, the son gripping his boarding pass tighter each time another question was asked. Malcolm answering calmly despite being interrupted. Those moments began changing the conversation. At first, people focused on the removal. Now they focused on the family. A journalist reviewing audience reactions noticed the pattern immediately. The gap story isn't becoming what happened to them, he said. It's becoming who they are. That observation spread quickly. The family's dignity removed the explanations many people normally reached for. There was no aggressive behavior to point at, no disrespectful language, no visible misconduct, only composure. And composure forced a harder question. If their behavior wasn't the reason, then what was? Inside executive offices, communication teams struggled to craft responses. Outside those offices, public opinion was moving in a different direction. People no longer wanted statements. They wanted answers. Every hour that passed made the family's quiet restraint more powerful. Without raising their voices, Malcolm, Angela, and their children had become the most credible people in the story, and credibility was beginning to outweigh authority. That realization unsettled people who had counted on authority. Alone, that realization reached the airline before sunrise. In conference rooms, private offices, and executive inboxes, notification alerts began appearing. One after another, the same video, the same headlines, the same unanswered questions. A regional manager opened the clip. For the 5th time that morning, has anyone confirmed what happened at the gate? Nobody answered immediately. Across the screen, participants exchanged uneasy looks. We're still gathering information, someone finally said. The response sounded weak, even to the person who gave it. Meanwhile, communication teams tracked engagement numbers, climbing higher every hour. One analyst stared at the dashboard. It's accelerating. How bad? The original post isn't the problem anymore. What is? The reposts. That answer changed the room. A single viral video could sometimes fade. Thousands of people discussing it at once was different. Inside another meeting, an executive watched Malcolm calmly speaking to security officers. Then he watched it again and again. The more he viewed the footage, the less comfortable he became. He doesn't look confrontational. Nobody disagreed. Another executive leaned forward. Do we know if their tickets were valid? Silence. The question that had spread across the internet was now moving through corporate offices. No one seemed eager to answer it. Internal messages multiplied throughout the afternoon. Legal teams requested reports. Managers asked for documentation. Investigators searched records. Every department wanted information. Very few had it. What concerned them most was not public. Anger. Anger often burned out. This felt different. People were studying details, comparing timelines, looking for inconsistencies. That kind of attention could uncover things companies preferred to keep buried. By evening, conversations had become noticeably shorter. Voices grew quieter. Nobody used the word crisis. Nobody mentioned panic, yet everyone felt the same. Pressure tightening around the organization. The incident was no longer being treated as an isolated complaint. It was becoming a question of responsibility, and responsibility carried consequences that public relations strategies alone could not erase. For the first time, protecting the company's image seemed less urgent than discovering the truth. For a few hours, executives had hoped the attention might slow down. It didn't. By sunrise, the video had crossed 1 million views. The number appeared on screens across the company like a warning. Nobody could ignore it. News websites embedded the footage. Bloggers published breakdowns. Commentators recorded reaction videos. Every hour brought another audience, another discussion, another set of questions. Inside the airline's communications office, televisions displayed different news channels. At the same time, a producer's voice echoed from one screen. Viewers want answers. Another channel asked the same question in different words. If the tickets were valid, why was the family removed? No official response appeared. That silence followed the story everywhere. In homes, offices, airports, and coffee shops, strangers watched the same clip. Some focused on Jessica. Others watched the children. Many replayed Malcolm's calm expression. The footage contained no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no threats, no resistance. Yet that restraint made the incident harder to dismiss. People expected anger. Instead, they saw composure, and composure invited scrutiny. Across social media, comments multiplied faster than anyone could track. What justified this? What aren't we being told? Why hasn't the airline answered? The conversation had changed. At first, people wanted to know what happened. Now they wanted to know why it happened. That difference worried executives far more. A mistake could sometimes be explained. A motive was harder to defend. Meanwhile, Jessica sat alone in her apartment scrolling through headlines. At first she told herself that outrage would fade. The internet always moved on. But every article seemed larger than the last. Every discussion pulled more people into the story. For the first time, strangers around the world were examining her decisions, frame by frame. Not her intentions, not her reputation, her actions. And with every passing hour, the distance between those two things seemed to grow. The questions were spreading faster than answers. And somewhere beneath the rising attention, the protection she had always counted on was beginning to weaken. As questions multiplied online, reporters stopped treating the Reed family as a passing headline. Newsrooms that had spent the morning discussing viral footage were now assigning people to verify names, travel records, and public backgrounds. What began as a search for context slowly became something else. "Do we know who Malcolm Reed is?" one editor asked. "Not yet," a researcher replied. "But I'm finding more than I expected." Across several offices, similar conversations unfolded. "Check his professional history." "Already doing it." "Anything unusual?" A pause followed. "Actually, yes. Very unusual." The assumption beneath the story had always been simple. Many viewers unconsciously pictured an ordinary traveler caught in an unfortunate dispute. Reporters expected a routine background check. Instead, they discovered years of public service, legal advocacy, and respected work that stretched far beyond a single airport terminal. One journalist stared at her screen. "Wait, he's that Malcolm Reed." Another reporter looked over. "The civil rights attorney?" "Yes." For a moment, neither spoke. The story was beginning to change. Phone calls followed. "Can you confirm this award?" "Confirmed." "This board appointment?" "Confirmed." "These court cases?" All real. With every answer, the original narrative weakened further. Meanwhile, producers prepared evening broadcasts. "We need to be careful," one anchor said. "Because he's prominent?" "No, because people assumed things before checking facts." That distinction mattered. By afternoon, articles started appearing. Not angry articles, not sensational ones, just detailed timelines showing who Malcolm Reed actually was. At home, Malcolm ignored most notifications flooding his phone. Angela glanced toward him. "They found your biography." Malcolm gave a tired smile. "I figured they would eventually." "Does it help?" He considered the question. "It shouldn't matter who I am." Angela nodded slowly. Because that was the uncomfortable truth emerging from every investigation. The family's dignity had never depended on titles, awards, or achievements. Yet as reporters kept pulling on a single thread, they were exposing how quickly assumptions collapsed when facts finally entered the room. "You found something?" Maya asked. "More than something," Daniel replied. "Look at this." The newsroom grew quieter as files filled the monitor. Civil rights litigation, voting access cases, employment discrimination. He worked on all of these. Daniel nodded. And won many of them. Maya scrolled farther. "Why wasn't any of this mentioned yesterday?" "Because nobody was looking at him. They were looking at the video." She opened another article. State Reform Commission, Federal Testimony, Community Legal Defense Program. Maya leaned back. This isn't a man who stumbled into a headline. No. He spent years helping other people survive headlines. Around them, reporters stopped chasing rumors and started reading records. One editor walked over. "What do we actually know?" Daniel answered carefully. "We know his tickets were valid according to early sources. We know he stayed calm. And we know his professional history is extensive." The editor studied the screen. "Then the story is shifting." "How?" "Yesterday, people saw a passenger. Today they're seeing a person." Across social media, links to Malcolm's work began circulating beside the airport footage. A producer called from another desk. "Local leaders are commenting now. Supportive." "Very." Maya glanced at another document. "Listen to this." He represented families who said nobody listened to them. Daniel exhaled slowly. Now nobody can ignore him. The irony settled over the room. For hours, strangers had debated Malcolm without knowing his name. Now his history spoke for itself. The airport incident remained important, but it no longer stood alone. Each article uncovered another layer, another accomplishment, another example of patient advocacy. The deeper reporters dug, the harder it became to fit Malcolm into the assumptions that had followed him through the gate. Nobody said it aloud at first. They simply kept reading, and the story kept changing before everyone's eyes. They kept reading, because every new document seemed to answer one question while creating another. The airport footage remained open on several screens, but now it shared space with legal archives, interviews, and public records. Then a producer suddenly stopped scrolling. "Hold on." Nobody looked up immediately. "I know that name." That got their attention. Across the room, an editor turned away from a monitor. "What name?" "Malcolm Reed." A brief silence followed. The producer stared at the screen. "No way." Another journalist walked over. "What is it?" The producer pointed toward an article published years earlier. "He worked on this case." The journalist's eyes widened. "Wait, that's Malcolm Reed." The sentence traveled through the newsroom faster than any headline. Conversations stopped. Phones lowered. Several people exchanged uncertain looks. Not because Malcolm was a celebrity, not because he was wealthy, because they suddenly understood who he was. An editor slowly sat down. "You're telling me the man removed from that flight spent his career fighting discrimination cases?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Nobody spoke for a moment. The irony felt impossible to ignore. For years, Malcolm had represented people who claimed they were judged unfairly. He had listened to stories that powerful institutions dismissed. He had challenged systems that insisted procedures were more important than people. And now he had become part of a story that looked painfully familiar. One reporter shook her head. He must have recognized what was happening immediately. "Probably." Another voice came from the back. "Maybe that's why he stayed calm." The room fell quiet again. That observation lingered. People had interpreted Malcolm's composure as patience. Now it looked more like experience. Not the experience of someone surprised by discrimination. The experience of someone who had seen it before. As that realization spread through newsrooms, broadcasts, and online discussions, the public conversation shifted again. The question was no longer whether something unfair had happened. The question became far more uncomfortable. If even Malcolm Reed could be treated this way, how many others had nobody bothered to recognize? That question refused to disappear. Instead, it pushed journalists deeper into Malcolm's history. Old newspaper archives resurfaced. Court transcripts were shared. Television interviews from years earlier began circulating online. The public wasn't discovering a single event. They were discovering a pattern. One article revisited a workplace discrimination case. Another examined a housing dispute involving racial profiling. A third focused on young men, repeatedly stopped and questioned without cause. Different cities, different years, different circumstances. Yet one name appeared again and again: Malcolm Reed. A commentator reviewing the timeline paused midway through a broadcast. "Look at this," she said. "For 20 years he has been challenging institutions that insisted they did nothing wrong." Her co-host nodded, and most of those institutions initially defended themselves. The similarities were difficult to ignore: silence, procedure, internal reviews, carefully worded explanations. The same defenses appeared repeatedly. Meanwhile, online discussions shifted toward Jessica's decision, not with anger alone, with disbelief. One viral post captured public attention. "So let me understand this correctly. A man spent decades fighting discrimination. Then someone judged him based on appearance. Before learning who he was, millions saw the message. Thousands shared it. The contradiction felt almost impossible to explain away." Jessica had trusted assumptions. Malcolm had built a career challenging them. The story was no longer centered on a removal from a flight. It was centered on the thinking that made that removal possible. As days passed, public reaction evolved again. Earlier comments expressed sympathy. Now they expressed admiration. Videos of Malcolm speaking at community events spread rapidly. Former clients shared personal stories. Colleagues described his work. Families thanked him publicly. The internet stopped viewing him as a victim, trapped in a viral moment. People began seeing something larger, a legacy. At the same time, pressure on the airline intensified. Every article uncovered more context. Every interview raised new questions. And every revelation reinforced the same uncomfortable conclusion. The family had been underestimated, but the greater mistake was underestimating the truth waiting behind them. And that truth was only beginning to surface. The truth waiting behind Malcolm Reed did not stop with him. It opened a door, and once that door opened, people who had spent years carrying old memories began looking at them differently. A local reporter posted a simple request online: "If you witnessed or experienced something similar, contact us." For most of the day, nothing happened. The story continued moving, but no new voices appeared. Then just before evening, a message arrived. It contained only one sentence: "I thought I was the only one." The reporter stared at the screen. No accusations, no demands, just exhaustion. The message was published anonymously. Within hours, others followed. A decorated black veteran agreed to speak publicly. "I served my country for 22 years, he said during an interview. The reporter listened quietly. "What happened?" "They removed me from an airline lounge." "Were you given a reason?" "They called it a misunderstanding later." He looked away. But nobody misunderstood the people sitting beside me. The silence after that answer said enough. The next story came from a physician, a respected specialist. A woman accustomed to difficult situations, yet one memory still lingered. "I showed my ticket," she paused. "Then my identification." Another pause. "Then my credentials." The interviewer frowned, and after that, they asked again. The frustration in her voice remained controlled, almost practiced. I convinced myself reporting it wouldn't matter. She looked directly into the camera. Now I'm not so sure. More stories emerged. A student embarrassed during boarding. A family separated without explanation. A businessman who watched everything and never spoke. During a televised discussion, the host asked a simple question. Why speak now? One guest answered first. I stayed quiet. Another nodded. So did I. The audience remained still. Then a third guest leaned forward. Not anymore. The words spread across social media within hours. Not anymore. 3 ordinary words. Yet they carried the weight of years. As testimony accumulated, public opinion shifted decisively. What once appeared to be a single controversy now looked like something much larger. A pattern, a history, and history, unlike an isolated incident, could not be dismissed, minimized, or quietly buried once people finally started comparing notes. The phrase "not anymore" continued spreading long after the interviews ended. Inside the airline's headquarters, executives watched the growing coverage with increasing concern. What they expected to fade after a few news cycles was becoming larger every day. By morning, an email reached employees across multiple departments, mandatory interviews, internal review, immediate cooperation required. People read the notice twice. Some closed their laptops and stared at the wall. Others immediately remembered conversations they had spent years trying to forget. Officially, the company called it a fact-finding process. Unofficially, everyone understood something had changed. The review began quietly. Employees entered conference rooms one at a time. Investigators asked simple questions. At first, answers sounded careful, professional, controlled. Then details started emerging. A supervisor recalled complaints that never received follow-up. Another remembered passengers, raising concerns that disappeared after management became involved. What happened to those reports? An investigator asked. I don't know. You signed them. I forwarded them. To whom? The supervisor hesitated. I can't remember. But memories kept returning. Small incidents. Dismissed concerns. Meetings where uncomfortable discussions suddenly ended. The deeper investigators looked, the more familiar the stories became. Soon, archived files began covering conference tables. Dates differed. Names differed. Patterns did not. During one tense review session, an investigator lifted a folder. This complaint matches 3 others. Nobody responded. He opened another file.
And this one? Still nothing. Finally, he pointed toward a report. Why wasn't this investigated? A manager cleared his throat. It was closed. The investigator looked up. By whom? Silence. Nobody volunteered an answer. Nobody defended the decision. That silence travelled through the room like a warning. In hallways, conversations stopped when investigators approached. Managers spoke more carefully. Executives avoided direct questions. People who once defended company leadership now avoided discussing the situation altogether. The problem was no longer one employee. It was no longer one family. It was no longer one video. For the first time, the institution found itself facing something it could not easily control. The investigation had started with a complaint. Now it was uncovering a system that had spent years protecting itself from uncomfortable truths. The investigation continued expanding, but for Jessica, the consequences had already become personal. Every morning now began the same way: a vibrating phone, another headline, another notification, another stranger discussing her name. She opened one article, then another, then another. The story seemed impossible to escape. At first, she convinced herself the outrage would fade. People online always moved on. A new scandal would arrive. A new target would appear. But the notifications never slowed. They multiplied. Every vibration carried fresh criticism, fresh questions, fresh footage. For the first time, certainty began slipping away. At work, the change felt even worse. The hallway that once welcomed her suddenly felt unfamiliar. Co-workers who used to stop and chat now offered brief nods. Some looked away completely. Others ended conversations when she approached. Nobody confronted her directly. Nobody needed to. The distance spoke clearly enough. Jessica kept waiting for support, for someone to tell her everything would be fine. Instead, management emails arrived filled with careful language, neutral language, protective language. Language designed to avoid commitment. During one meeting, she finally asked the question directly: "Is the company standing behind me?" The manager glanced toward a prepared statement. "We're monitoring the situation." Jessica waited. Nothing followed. No reassurance, no promise, no defense. The meeting ended almost immediately afterward. That answer stayed with her long after she returned home. Late that evening, she opened an old photo album on her phone. Award ceremonies, company dinners, recognition events. Years of smiling faces. People who once celebrated beside her. People who now seemed strangely absent. She sent messages. Few replies came back. Those that did felt cautious, distant, temporary. For several minutes, she stared at a photograph from an employee gala. She barely recognized the woman smiling confidently into the camera. A difficult realization settled over her. The company was no longer deciding how to protect her. It was deciding how to protect itself. And for the first time, Jessica wondered whether she had already been left behind. The story did not end with a termination letter, a viral video, or a courtroom decision. Months later, life moved forward the way it always does. Flights continued taking off. Airports remained crowded. People hurried past one another without knowing the stories they carried. But something had changed. The airline introduced reforms. Complaints that once disappeared were now investigated. Employees received training that forced difficult conversations. Passengers who had stayed silent before began speaking when they saw something wrong. For Jessica, the consequences lasted far beyond the headlines. The respect she once believed was permanent had vanished, leaving her alone with the choices she could no longer explain away. In the quiet that followed, she finally understood a truth she had spent years avoiding. Prejudice does not always arrive with anger. Sometimes it hides behind confidence, routine, and the belief that personal judgment is never wrong. For Malcolm and his family, the experience was not something they celebrated. Justice could not erase the humiliation their children had felt that day. Yet they refused to let that moment define them. Their dignity had survived an attempt to take it away. At a community gathering months later, one of Malcolm's children asked if people could really change. Malcolm smiled softly before answering. "Sometimes they do." The room fell silent. Not because everyone agreed, not because every problem had been solved, but because everyone understood what was at stake. In the end, the most important victory was not that someone powerful faced consequences. It was that a family who had been told, without words, that they did not belong, refused to accept that lie. Because injustice survives when people look away. And change begins the moment someone decides they won't. The flight was forgotten. The lesson was not. And long after the headlines faded, the truth remained exactly where it belonged, in the light. The truth remained exactly where it belonged, in the light.